because we're going to start. We are going to start, and welcome. Shabbat Hagadol 2025.
Can you mute everybody?
Can everybody mute, please?
Non si vede, fa vedere.
If everybody mutes, then the sound should be perfect. Once upon an Erev Pessach that fell on a Shabbat, mandate versus mimesis. Okay, line 3. I'm reading from the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which was put together. Could everybody mute, please? Put together before the Talmud Bavli, and I'm going to read a bit, and then I'm going to explain a lot. Zo halacha nelma miziktei b'teira. A halacha was hidden from the elders of Beteira. Batira is a place in northern Israel. Pal Arba Saliot b'Shabbat, 14th of Nisan, the day that we shech the Korban Pesach and prepare it for the great barbecue in the Azara on Pesach night, the Seder. That day fell on a Shabbat, as it does this year. V'lo hayu yodin in Pesach doche et haShabbat im lav. And the Bnei Beteira did not know, the Bnei Beteira, whether they could prepare their Korban Pesach on Shabbat. After all, in those days, you had to slaughter the animal, skin the hide, prepare it all, and get it ready, because as soon as night fell and Shabbat was out, you're getting on with the Seder, the centerpiece of which was the Korban Pesach. But of course, on Shabbat, you can't do all these things. You can't slaughter, you can't skin, you can't string out hides, and you can't prepare the meat. So what could be done to save Seder night in the Bet HaMikdash? We're talking about 60 or 70 years before the Common Era. So, interestingly enough, the Shalmi continues, Amru, yesh kam Bavli echad. Well, you know, there's this kind of Babylonian here. We'd say the chutznik, okay? Somebody who's not from Israel, foreigner, he's a Babylonian. The Hillel Shmo, his name happens to be Hillel. Sheshimesh et Shmaya va'Avtalion. Now, he was very close and very respectful and very helpful to Shmaya and Avtalion. So, I'll explain this as we go, and I'll just finish this on the next line. Yodea im Pesach dochet haShabbat im lav. He might know, this Babylonian might know whether we can do all these forbidden things on Shabbat to get our Korban Pesach ready. Efshar sheyesh mimenu tochelet, and here you can hear the Israelites looking down on the Babylonians. He might be useful after all. But what do these Babylonians know anyhow? Shalchu v'karulo, so they sent for him and they said, Shamata mimecha kishachal yudalidot b'Shabbat im dochet haShabbat im lav. Have you heard anything about our case, our problem, which is, does the law of preparing the Korban Pesach override the law of keeping Shabbat? Now, a little bit of fleshing out here. According to Rabbi Aaron Hyman, who is actually a Lithuanian, from Slutsk, learned in Navardok and Volozhin, and very close to the Natsir, the Rosh Yeshiva, who organized his Shidduch. But in 1884, he came to London. He was born in 1863, and he stayed in London. He was a founder of the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Thrall Street in the East End. Amongst its luminaries was the Mashgiach, Reb Eliel Lapyan, and Reb Zev Gurevich gave a shiur there for a while until he went up to Gateshead. He also set up the Agudas HaShochtim and organized the Shkita. But he was quite an incredible scholar, not only in traditional stuff, but he was a historian. And he explains that Bnei Beteira were a Jerusalemite family in the period, as I said, about 60 BCE. Now, that time was a civil war here between the two sons of Alexander Yanai and Shlom Tzion Hamalka. You may have gone to Shlom Tzion Hamalka Street in Jerusalem. She was a member of the Hasmonean family, married to Alexander Yanai, who was as well. But her brother, according to the tradition, was Shimon ben Shetach. So she's well connected in rabbinical circles. Alexander Yanai leaned towards the priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem at the time, many of whom were Hellenists. And you listen to his name, Alexander, Yanai, all quite Greek. And there was a fight, serious fight. There was a bloody civil war, actually, because after Alexander Yanai died, his wife reigned for 9 years, and she was somehow able to keep the peace. But once she died, her two sons, John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, you couldn't be more Greek than
Don't you want to hear it?
Aristobulus. Could
But
you
what?
please mute? Could everybody mute, please?
Oh, you mean for sure?
Early.
Could everybody mute? Thank you. So, actually, of course, it was Aristobulus I was at. They fought. And the temptation always was to involve a foreign power to gain an upper hand in your civil war. And the the other power, of course, was Rome. So what Antipater did, who was an Edomi, Idumean at the court, he was in the party of Yochanan Hyrcanus. He invited the Romans, and they came in under Pompey, the famous Pompey, and Aristobulus was basically thrown out, but Antipater was plotting. His son was Herod, and he was plotting to have Rome come in and get his son to rule, and it would make Judah into a puppet Roman state. So who are the B'nai Betera? What happened, of course, was that John Hyrcanus was weak. He was made what they call an ethnarch in Greek. And as I said, it became a Roman puppet state. And then Herod changed sides when Hyrcanus fell out of favor. It was no problem. And eventually Herod took over, and we know about the Herodian age. So B'nai Betera are a family related to or close to the priestly aristocracy, who were, as it were, standing in for the Nasi. Traditionally, the Nasi had been a learned Perushi Pharisee rabbi, but now, because of the war and the struggles and the bloodshed, they were caretakers. The Gemara puts it a little differently, that they were paving the way for Hillel. But historically speaking, Rabbi Hyman puts us squarely in the period and the time, and it makes sense that B'nai Betera didn't know the din, because even though Erev Pessach falls on Shabbat is a rare occurrence, it nevertheless is something which you will expect the Nasi of the Sanhedrin to know the answer for. So this explains this rather surprising circumstance that the B'nai Betera or Ziknei Betera did not know the din. It also explains their rather parsimonious attitude towards Hillel and Shmaya and Avtalion. Now, those Shmaya and Avtalion are a zug. They're mentioned in Pirkei Avot, and they are one of the combinations, the pairs of the Nasi and the Av Bedin. It's clearer from elsewhere in the Gemara, again, you have to push it a bit, that they were not in favor. They were not favored by the aristocracy, the Kohanim, the Mityavnim, the Hellenists. And in particular, we have an incident in Masechet Yoma when a Kohen Hagadol says and makes a snide remark about their being descendants of Gerim. According to the Gemara, they were descendants of Sancheriv, Melech Ashur, Shmaya, and Avtalion. So Shmaya and Avtalion had their house of study in Jerusalem, but because of the war, the conflict, and the tension, the hatred between Prushim and the Tzlukim or the Mityavnim, they were kind of marginalized. And that's why it says that Hillel was the one who was close to them, and he was a Babylonian. So one outsider finds comfort in another outsider, and that's part of the background to this story. Now, what happened when B'nai Betera summoned Hillel? They need to find a solution, and they know that the people will not be happy unless the solution has some, if you like, halachic basis or some basis in real practice. They are not competent, okay? So they have to go to Hillel, and because he's the one remaining Prushi, and the Prushim were gaining power, So they say, this Babylonian might be a little useful. Now, what does he do? And here I'm going to tell you what he does. He says, well, you know what? There's a Kal Vachomer and there is a Gzera Shava. Now, Kal Vachomer means a logical argument, going from a lenient to a strict. In other words, if we can offer up a Korban Tamid, the regular offering in the Bet Mikdash on a Shabbat, then how much more will we be able to offer up or prepare a Korban Pesach on Shabbat? Why? Because if you don't bring the Korban Tamid, the continual daily offering, in the Bet Mikdash on Shabbat, the worst you've done is not fulfilled a positive commandment. Whereas, if you don't bring a Korban Pesach, the punishment is karet, excision, terrible punishment. So clearly, if you can prepare a Korban Tamid on Shabbat, you can definitely prepare a Korban Pesach on Shabbat. The other is a Gzera Shava, which is an analogy using similar words. In relation to the Korban Tamid, the continual offering that was offered twice a day, morning and evening, okay, including Shabbat, Torah says in Parashat Pinchas, you shall offer it b'mo'ado, in its appointed time. And we know that the Korban Tamid was offered on the Shabbat because it says, U'b'yom Shabbat shnei tfasim b'nei shana. So clearly, you sacrificed, prepared and sacrificed that offering on Shabbat. Now, the same word occurs in Pesach, b'mo'ado, in its proper time. So we learn from the mo'ado that we do know in Shabbat and Tamid that you can prepare it on Shabbat, and we go to Korban Pesach, we say the same word, fill in the gap, but mo'ado means Shabbat. So Hillel has used textual devices, interpretation, in order to solve a halakha issue and make the people happy. Now, what happens next? B'nei b'teira, because of the changing times and the balance of power moving towards the Prushim, and the people are supporting them against the aristocracy and against the priestly caste and the Hellenizers, they say to him, well, okay, we could argue with you. On line 11, they say, we could argue. We could say, look, Korban Tamid is actually Holy of Holies. It's eaten inside the temple by the Kohanim. Now, Pesach is a Kodashim Kalim, as we know from the Shlosh Esrei Midot, Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Pesach is a lighter degree of sanctity. So how do you know that you can go from a serious degree of sanctity to a lower degree of sanctity? Now, as I can argue your point on logic. Gzera Shava, similarly. Now, here we have a principle that developed over the years. But in Eretz Israel, in Yerushalmi, which is more people-oriented than interpretation-oriented, I made a big statement, and I'm just going to leave it at that now. We have a rule, Ein Adam Dan Gzera Shava Be'atzmo. That was actually adopted in the Babylonian Talmud at the end of the period when Rabbeinu and Rav Ashi edited the Talmud. They say you can't simply come up with a Gzera Shava. And there's a lot to be said about that, but one point is very salient. If I find two similar words in a text, well, what are the chances of me finding two similar words in a very long text like the Torah? Very high. So I could be going all over the text. I could make all sorts of deductions based upon similarity of words or similar phrases, and I could take the law to ridiculous places. So the problem is that of being arbitrary. Okay, it's too arbitrary. The words themselves. So when you have a very small text, a very small number of people who can read the text, you might be able to do that. So Gzera Shava falls out of fashion. Kal Vachomer, though, is strong. But then you can argue with a Kal Vachomer, and that's what it says in line 14. Lefikach mishivin mekal vachomer, ve'en mishivin migzera shava. And therefore, we can refute the Kal Vachomer. So we continue to use it because it's based upon logic. But Hillel doesn't give up. He says, you might have answers, but I'm going to show you a whole system of Hilchot HaPesach using the drasha. Clearly, B'nai B'Teira were not very skilled at that. And whoever argued back with Hillel was not B'nai B'Terah, but it was the people who were advising them, or the editors of the Talmud Yerushalmi. So at the end, what does Hillel say? Kach shamati mishmaya v'Avtalyon. I have it. It's a tradition from Shmaya and Avtalyon, and they go back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Kevan sheshamu mimenu ken amdu uminu oto nasi alehem. B'nai B'Terah realized that this is the man who can probably solve the problem of bringing the Prushim to cooperate with them in the next peregrination of the struggle and the problem with Rome. So they say, okay, you know what? We'll make you the Nasi. You do know what you're talking about. Now, Kevan Shemino Oto Nasi, what happens next? Pride cometh before a fall. So Hillel says, you know what your problem is and why you didn't know the halakha? Because you didn't learn. Mi garam lachem litzroch labavli hazeh. You needed to go to this Babylonian. Okay? And the reason is, why did you have this falling off? Because you did not respect Shmaya and Avtalyon and you didn't learn. Now, Hillel, if you remember, when he was starting out his career, he'd come from Babylon to Eretz Israel, he earned very little. And one coin he used to buy food and pay his rent, and the other coin he'd pay to get into the Bet Midrash of Shmaya and Avtalyon, Torah learning costs. And one day he didn't earn enough to listen to the shiur. So what did he do? It was in the winter, climbed up and listened to the skylight. And then snow fell. It was in Shvat. And he was covered in about quite a few feet of snow. And Shmaya and Avtalyon are giving their shiur, and they say, no, it's a bit dark in the roof area. They go up and they find him, and they are Mechalel Shabbat to bring him back from his frozen state. They say, Ra'ui zeh v'chalel alav et Shabbat. Why do you think? Well, his life may have been in danger, but because he put himself into it, perhaps there was a question. Whatever it was, Hillel certainly, Shmaya and Avtalyon, he certainly was a learner, okay? But as I said, pride cometh before a fall. So he said, you know what? Your problem is you didn't go to learn with Shmaya and Avtalyon. As soon as he said that, and he made them feel bad, Nelma halakha mimenu. It often happens, your emotions get in the way of your reason. Suddenly, you forget the halakha. Because they asked him a question. The people said, okay, we know we can prepare the Korban Pesach, but can we bring our knives up to the Azara, to the temple area, on Shabbat, if we hadn't deposited them before Shabbat? And Hillel has to say, you know what? I knew this law once, but I forgot it. Then he says something very nice. Line 19, Ela hanichu Israel. Leave it to Israel. Imeinan niviim b'nei niviim hem. They are not prophets themselves. They are the children of prophets, their ancestors. So they will know. Miyad. So immediately, what happened was that when the people came up on Shabbat and they had to bring their knives, those who had a goat stuck it in the horns of the goat, and those who brought a EWE, they stuck it in the wool. And when Hillel saw this, he remembered the halakha, and he said, Kach shamati mishmaya v'Avtalyon. Now line 22, Rabbi Zira b'Shem Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kol Torah shein la beit av eino Torah. The Yerushalmi says the basis of Torah is a beit av, is a tradition. What you saw, what you grew up with, what stands behind you generation after generation. The learning, the textual stuff is very nice, very brilliant, and can often give us a feeling of confidence that we've gotten the right answer, but that is not what we are really after. That is what I mean by the mimesis. Mimesis is a Greek word, and it means from the Greek mimos, which is to imitate. Can you give me a word that we use that really shows you how the English language has adopted the Greek? Imitate, mime, okay? Or mimeograph. Do you remember that word? A copier, a mimeograph, the same word. So that is the Talmud Yerushalmi. Same sugya appears in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Talmud Bavli, and there it's much less critical of Babylonians doesn't put Hillel down. Of course, this is the Babylonian Talmud, so you wouldn't expect them to be doing that. But basically, it's the same story. Kal v'chomer, zera shava, Hillel proves the point, and he's not answered back. That's the thing. And he's accepted, okay, as the new Nasi. He's punished for his pride, but then he says the same thing. Go out and see what the people do. Now, I'm assembling a couple of sources from corpus of halakha. Would everybody who's chatting please mute or be quiet? Thank you. Gimel, line 36. This is a basic sugya masechet brachot. Hashotem mayim nitzma'o. If you want to drink water to quench your thirst, not like to swallow a pill. Mavarech shakol nihiya bidvaro. You make a bracha shakol nihiya bidvaro. It was created. Some, under the influence of mysticism and Hasidic lore, say shakol nihiyeh, because God needs to be there all the time looking after the flight of a bumblebee and of the growing of a plant. So it's a different theology. You can pick whatever you want. Rabbi Tarfon Omer, Borei nefashot rabot v'chesronan. Rabbi Tarfon says, before you have a drink of water, the bracha is Borei nefashot. Hilchet tamai. So what is the halakha? The Gemara says in lovely Aramaic, Huk hazi my ama dabar. Huk, go out. Hazi, see. My ama, what the people dabar, who are outside, bar, like Breita, outside of the Mishnah. Go and see what the people do. And the halakha is the halakha we know. We make a sha'akol before water, and there will be cases where we might make a borei nefashot afterwards. But whatever the case may be, Huk chazim, that's exactly what Hillel was told himself that he had to do. Go and see. The people are the carriers of the chain of tradition. They will know the answer. You don't always know everything in your brilliance and in your pilpulistic artistry. So, another extract from the Rosh, the Chach Amru B'Yerushalmi. Now, this again doesn't surprise us because, as I said, major thesis. I think the Bavli is rule-oriented. Yerushalmi is people-oriented. Shalmi goes for mimesis, and the Bavli goes for textual interpretation. And there's a lot to be said about that. We won't say it now. When halakha is not clear, this is the Rosh speaking in the 13th century. Okay, when the halakha is not clear, rofef, it's weak. Then the minhag fills in the gap. Peirushim yesh rifayon she'en barur lecha kemi nifsaka halakha. Now you've read a lot of halakha, but you don't know how to paskin. V'ra'ita she'noagin, and you see there is a custom and people act a certain way. Haloch achar haminhag, follow the minhag. V'yesh litlot she'nireh ligdolim she'nhigu haminhag she'halakha kach. And one can assume that the halakha that the people practice through their minhag has a basis in what the great rabbis of the past said. This is exactly Hillel, Shamati Mishmaya ve'Av Talion. So Hillel, in fact, embraces both approaches. He begins with the text, interpretation, genius, okay? I can do amazing things. I could recreate the entire Torah just by my legal
Acumen.
Acumen is a good word. We can also say brilliance. But at the same time, Hillel has to admit, at the end of the day, I cannot do the job by myself. And there's a famous story which is kind of cute, but the story is told of the Shagas Aryeh Reb Asher Ginsburg, that he was at a spa with Rabbi Levi Halperin, who had written a book on Jewish history, Seder Hadorot. So they're chatting as they come out of you can see them in their towels, coming out of the spa, sitting in the cooling off room, talking about the future of the Jewish people. And the Shagas Aryeh says, you know what, if everybody forgot the Torah entirely and all of halakha, I could recreate it using my genius and my brilliance. Rabbi Halperin said to him, that's very, very impressive. But if people read the past and they follow the accounts that I've written of our great rabbis, they never will forget the Torah and Torah Shebal Peh. So that's just a cute story to complement what we've read about an Erev Pessach that fell on a Shabbat. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read from a famous essay by Chaim Soloveitchik called Rupture and Reconstruction. And it really does deal with this issue. And I'm going to follow this up with a little foray into the Mishnah Brura versus the Aruch HaShulchan, and flesh out the tension between the mimesis and the mandate. Mandate, of course, means the binding law. So this is in English, and I will read. Halacha is not only a comprehensive text-based regulation of daily life, it constitutes a way of life. And a way of life is not learned, but rather absorbed. Its transmission is mimetic, mimesis, mimetic, copied from the past, from how you grew up and what you saw. Imbibed from parents and friends and patterned on a conduct regularly observed in home and street, synagogue and school. The question is, did these mimetic norms conform to the legal ones? That's what we want to ask. Okay. Many of us come from a mimetic tradition, but we know there's halakha. We've learned a lot of stuff, Gemara, Shas, Poskim, and there must be tension somewhere, and there is, of course. Now, Chaim Soloveitchik, son of Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, professor of history, one time at the Hebrew University, but now in Bernard Revel, the graduate studies, School of Jewish Studies at YU. The answer is at times yes, at times no. And the significance of the no may best be brought home by an example with which we're all familiar, the kosher kitchen. Okay, Deb, are you listening? With its rigid separation of milk and meat, separate dishes, sinks, dish racks, towels, tablecloths, even separate cupboards. Actually, little of this has a basis in halakha. Sorry, but strictly speaking, there's no need for separate sinks, for separate dish towels. In fact, the food is served cold, there's no need for separate dishware altogether. In fact, the simple fact is that the traditional Jewish kitchen, you may remember that the Mishnah Brura went into his wife's kitchen. He went into the kitchen and he was criticizing all the separations. And his wife says, Mrs. Mishnah Brura, Mrs. Chofetz Chaim says, get out of my kitchen, you're trafing it up. That's exactly the story here. You know, one can speak in the name of halakha till one is blue in the face, but if you dare mix your towels, then you'll be drummed out, and you're lucky that you'll still be given the title of observant Jew. The simple fact is that the traditional Jewish kitchen, transmitted from mother to daughter over generations, has been immeasurably and unrecognizably amplified beyond all halachic requirements. Its classic contours are the product of not of legal exegesis. It's not that people were learning a Talmud and poskim, and then they said, let's see if we can organize our kitchen accordingly. It would look very different. But of the housewife's religious intuition imparted in kitchen apprenticeship. Some of us weren't so lucky and some didn't have their mothers to teach them, but this is the way we Orthodox Jews run our kitchens. It's based upon the mimetic tradition. Now, Chaim Soloveitchik, line 11 says, an augmented tradition is one thing. To augment is to add to, okay? You can add and make life more difficult as much as you want. And there seems to be a psychological drive to do that. And Pesach is an outstanding example. Outstanding. Because we drive ourselves crazy. And if you look in the halakha, seriously, there's very little basis. Those who clean out their Lego, old, horrible things, bits of food stuck in the Lego, if you can't eat it, if nobody would eat that stuff stuck in the Lego, it can be in your home over Pesach. Put the Lego on the Seder table, okay? With the bits stuck in, it doesn't matter. It's not chametz. But, you know, this became the tradition all over the modern, you know, Lego world. Orthodox Jews apparently need to spend an hour or two with a toothbrush scraping the bits of food out of their Lego. You can go from one example to the other. The Kabbalistic approach, of course, is understandable because the Kabbalah says Chametz is Yetzer Hara, it's a Sitra Achra, that demonic and evil presence, and you've got to really root it out. But to do all of that stuff is augmenting. But let's talk about diminishing. What happens if your mimetic tradition clashes with halakha? Well, that also happens. So the question arises, did this mimetic tradition have an acknowledged position even when it went against the written law? Here too, often yes. And once again, concrete example best brings the matter home. There is an injunction against borer, sorting or separating on Shabbat. Now, the Isur, of course, is taking what you don't want, the psolet, out before you eat the basar, before you eat what you want to eat. So I could, of course, if I was going to be really extreme, say, if you have a pile of raincoats in shul or in your home after a very well-attended lunch, and somebody wants to get their raincoat, you cannot take other people's raincoats, which are the psolet. You have to bend down, grovel around, identify your raincoat, pull it out of the pile, even if you throw everybody else's raincoat on the floor. For those who accept borer in its strict form, the Aruch HaShulchan said it only applies to food. But nevertheless, we take borer very seriously. Books. People will make anything into an issue of borer, and they do, and there's a basis for it. You could argue that every concept has its core notion, and then the periphery, those things which it does affect. But let's have a look. However, we do eat fish. Now, some people eat fish, namely, they have fish on the bone. Okay? I don't mean gefilte fish, and there is a legend that gefilte fish was invented to get around borer. It's probably an urban.
In a piece of carp which is full of bones.
And they put in a piece of carp which is full of bones. Okay, so whatever it is. Would everybody please mute? Everybody mute. Thank you. So we don't have any interference. So fish on Shabbat, off the bone. And I know somebody is, but okay, we'll be tolerant. There is an injunction, and eating fish we must. How many of you do not serve fish on Shabbat? Very few. Well, the Yekkers don't, because they didn't like pulling out the bones, and they're getting their hands dirty, okay? But fish is traditionally part of Jewish Shabbat meals, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, unless you really don't like it, Shmuley, which may be the case. But there we are. If we are not to choke, we separate the bones from that meat. Before you put the meat in your mouth, get rid of the bones. That's borer, classical borer in food, according to the most lenient dayah of the Aruch HaShulchan. Borer applies to food. The upshot is that all Jews who ate fish on Shabbat, and historians, Romans, even mention the Jewish habit of fish eating, their predilection for fish, their piscine predilection, whatever that may be, okay, for 2,000 years have violated the Shabbat. Imagine that. I remember my uncle, who was very, very, very frum, delighting in the fish on the bone, the carp, pulling out the bones, eating the fish. Amachal al Shabbos. This seems absurd. But the truth of the matter is that it's very difficult to provide a cogent justification from separating bones from fish. So the Mishnah Brura does try. The Mishnah Brura says, well, actually, some bones are soft and you could eat them. Does that make any sense?
No, you could choke them.
I think that you're more likely to choke than to enjoy a soft bone. Then, realizing that he's really on very thin ice, he says, well, this is in Shin Yutet, okay? Dalit. He says, well, if you take it out as part of one action, or as he said, the act of eating involves the taking out of the bone, so it could be all called eating and not separating. You can feel that the Mishnah Brura, the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Israel, Meir HaKohen, Kagan, or Pupko, because he for a while used his father-in-law's family's name, Pupko, then he changed back to Kagan. Kagan, his father died when he was fairly young. Anyhow, got it in a cholera outbreak, whatever the case may be. Mishnah Berurah is working hard. He feels he has to have a textual justification for doing what Jews have been doing for 2,000 years, eating their fish off the bone on a Shabbat. And it's very difficult, okay? Very difficult. So, you know, I mean, I could ask you about eating avatiach on Shabbat. How many of you eat avatiach with the black pips? Some of you, right? What did you do? Did you scrape away the pips before you ate the watermelon? If you did, you could be accused of borer. So what you need to do, according to the Mishnah Berurah, you bite off a big piece of watermelon with its pips, and as you're chewing, you spit out the pips. The ones you get, the ones that go down your gullet, go down your gullet. But that would be the Mishnah Berurah's way of... Could we have everybody muted, please? Mute, please. Okay. Can somebody see who is not muted? I'm being told to look for the muter. The muter.
Ellie, well, he's muted now. He's muted.
Okay, great. We're all muted. Excellent. We're all mutants. Fantastic. All right. So, do you get the idea about the fish? Tough stuff. But people continue. As I said, I have memories of very from Jews in the shtetl, all enjoying their fish and removing the bones beforehand. Chaim Soloveitchik goes on, line 19. The problem of minimal requirement quantities, shurim. Now, this gets us into Pesach in a major way. Has been known since the mid-18th century when scholars in both Central and Eastern Europe discovered that the shurim commonly employed with regard to solid food, kazait. Why kazait? Because in the old days they didn't have grams or kilograms. They had agricultural products. You wanted to give people an idea of quantity. You said it's the size of an olive, size of a date, size of a fig, size of an egg. That's how it was all done, okay? Did not square with the volume shiurim that we know in other aspects of Jewish law. Suddenly, we look at Sugya in Brachot, the Sugya Masechet Pesachim, and we see that perhaps, you know, we are we're using smaller shiurim than we should according to the textual understanding. The ineluctable conclusion, that's a lovely word, ineluctable, you cannot avoid it. I can see Michael Gillis smiling away. The ineluctable conclusion was that the standard requisite quantity of solid food consumption should be roughly doubled. We should be eating double than what we are. That was the old Seder, the venerable grandfather leading the Seder breaks off a bit of matzah and gives it to each participant. No, that will not do. According to the textual reading, you're going to have 2/3 of a machine-baked matzah, 3/5 of a hand-baked matzah, and that's only the minimal. Because Onish will take you'll be eating matzah all night. Okay, but you have to stop by Chatzot. So, though the men who raised this issue, the Gra and the Nodab Yudah, the Gaon of Vilna, right, and Rabbi Yechezkel Landau and Nodab Yudah, were some of the most famous Talmudists of the modern era, whose works are to this day staples of rabbinic study. Their words fell on deaf ears and were without any impact even in the most scholarly and religiously meticulous circles. And it's a famous story that there was a young bocher, Gorovsky, in Bnei Brak, who decided to tease the Chazon Ish. Remember the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Yeshayahu Karelitz, the Litvak who came to Bnei Brak and eventually became the unanointed but unofficial leader of Haredi Jewry, certainly the Litvish aspect. And his scholarship, rabbinic scholarship, is outstanding, and he took this divergence of views and created a whole new set of measurements, much larger than what we had been used to. So Gorovsky says, on one Erev Pessach, we're talking about how much wine you need, what is a revit, Rav Avram Chaim Naeh, 80 cc's, Chazon Ish, 150 cc's. So young Gorovsky brings a becher to the Chazon Ish on Erev Pessach. Chazon Ish is very busy, but the young man interrupts him and says, Chazon Ish, what do you say about the kashrus of this becher? Chazon Ish looks at it and says, will not do at all. It's half the size. Go and buy yourself a new one. So Grofsky said, you know, this is in my family, and this is the kos of the Or Sameach, of the Meshech Chochmah, Rameir Simcha HaKohen of Dvinsk. Are you saying that the Or Sameach was never, ever keeping the halacha of drinking the Arba Kosot on Pesach because he didn't have enough? Gorovsky was driven out of the Chazon Ish's home, okay? Chutz banyak. But the point is made. We know, and Reb Mendel Zaks has a similar story about the Mishnah Brura's Kiddush cup given to him by his father-in-law, Pupko, and you may know the Pupko rabbinical dynasty, but that's Chafetz Chaim. He went back to Kagan, okay? He used that Kiddush cup because it was his father-in-law's Kiddush cup who supported him, and whatever it was. At the end of the day, the mimetic tradition is very powerful. So, and no textual analysis could affect in any way a millennia-old tradition. So all concerned Jews have been eating matzahs. We know how to eat matzahs. Problem was theoretically interesting, but practically irrelevant. And then a dramatic shift occurs. Now, what Chaim Soloveitchik does is he traces the transition from the mimetic to the textual. And he says that the position that had been around for close to 2 centuries, you have a textual tradition, you have the mimetic tradition, and they generally get on more or less with each other. In the 1950s, this changed. And within a decade, the textual approach becomes the regnant one. From then on, traditional conduct, no matter how venerable, how elementary, or how closely remembered, yields to the demands of theoretical knowledge. Established practice can no longer hold its own against the demands of the written word. Significantly, this loss by the home of its standing as religious authenticator has taken place not simply among the modern Orthodox, but first and foremost amongst the Haredim, and in their innermost recess, the home. The zealously sheltered hearth of the Haredi world can no longer validate religious practice. The authenticity of tradition is now in question in the ultra-Orthodox world itself. Lernen has overcome Minig, and now we are wondering what we do. Now I'm going to say a little more about this soon, but what I want to do, and I'm actually going to close the screen share unless anybody is really fascinated. Anybody? Shmuley, can I close?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share. And I want to say a little about this tension between the mimetic tradition, what observant Jews remember, what they do, what they treasure as ways of doing things, and the textual yeshiva type analysis, okay? And I want to compare 2 poskim. I want to compare the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Halevi Epstein, and I want to compare him with the Mishnah Berurah, as I said, Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan, earlier vintage Pupko, okay, so we'll start with Aruch HaShulchan. Aruch HaShulchan, born in 1829 in Babroisk, in Belarus, in the Mogilov region. You may remember that from the song in Ish Hasid Haya, Lefelech Mogilov, etc. But I'm not going to sing the song now. Anyhow, he was competent in Russian. He was got rabbinical Russian approval. He gave smicha to most of the famous poskim of the time, including Harav Kook, Rabbi Eliyahu Yosef Henkin, Dayan Yechezkel Abramsky, Rabbi Zevin, Rabbi Kahana Ponovich, and Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman, who became Maimon, Issa Zalman, Meltzer, and a whole slew of others. Tremendous Talmid Chacham. Published the Aruch HaShulchan, 1,705 simanim, covering the entire range of Jewish law. Now, he represents the last of those who accepted a partnership between text and mimesis. For him, was important to preserve the tradition and to champion it and to defend it against what he saw as a rising tide of textualism. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. But before that, I've got to tell you who his protagonist was. The Mishnah Brura, of course, was later. The years are 1838 till 1933. But talking about a Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Israel Meir Cohen was again an Ilui, a genius, when he was brought to Vilna, and he went off and started a yeshiva in Radin. Okay, he himself was born in Zetel, in Zetel, Polish or Yiddish, but in Zetel, and he started a yeshiva in Radin, and he got students flocked to him from all over. The kibbutz, the high top class there, and learned Seder Kochim. He was a Kohen who wanted to prepare seriously for the building of the Beit HaMikdash and the reinstitution of the temple rite, R-I-T-E. He wrote the famous Mishnah Brura, which is actually only on what we would call halachot in Orach Hayim, daily life. He didn't do like the Aruch HaShulchan, the entire scope of Jewish law, marriage and divorce and civil law and Shemitah, Yovel. No. He tells us what to do about our daily lives every day, every Shabbat, every Chag. This is the Mishnah Brura. He was a very important figure in the Haredi world and founding of the Aguda. But the Mishnah Brura is definitely classical textual analysis. So let's see. Does anybody know what a hakmesser is? I'm asking for people who know Yiddish. What's a hakmesser?
Some kind of knife.
Some kind of knife. The hak is to smash, and the messer is a knife. If you want to speak to me, you have to unmute.
Like a rounded blade,
It's a
the fish.
A rounded
fish.
blade. Wow, that's excellent. You know how to say that in Italian. Mezzaluna, which is
Moon knife.
a half moon. Mezzaluna, exactly. But the Jews in the shtetl used their hakmesser to chop up onions very finely, okay? So they were, they had a simpler diet, but whenever they wanted to chop up their onions, they used this
Oh, they
curved,
still have it. Yeah.
curved knife. I'm told on my left that we still have it, the famous hakmesser. Now, the question is that called tochen, grinding up using an instrument specific for grinding? And we know from Hilchot Shabbat that you may not use an instrument that's specific for a task that is in fact prohibited. You cannot grind up. Tochen. So, but everybody used the hakmesser. So the Mishnah Brura says, of course, in Shin Kaf Aleph, Siv Katan Mem Hey, the Yesh Li Zaher b'ma shenoagin lachtok b'tzalim dak dak. Be careful when you chop up your onions very fine. Shelo yitchakem bikli shekorin hakmesser. Don't use the hakmesser because halachically, analytically, it's the wrong thing to use. Now, what does the Aruch HaShulchan say? Okay, the representative of the earlier age that combined mimetics and text, as against the Mishnah Brura, who solidly a Rosh Yeshiva, head of the Kolel, and text-based. Rabbis are coming along and saying, no, you can't use the hakmesser. But that is not clear to me at all. Gam ken sakin uva ribaism. חשש לאסור ולגרור גבינה במורג חרוץ וקוראים לזה שזהו עשוי לטחון דק דק. And that is tochen, but the sakin, that is called a hakmesser. In other words, there is a ribaisen. Do you know what a ribaisen is?
Like a crater.
That's a grater that grates things very fine. Now, you can do a much more efficient job with the grater than you can do with the hakmesser. And anybody who's chopped onions knows, well, at least I do, it's much easier to chop it with a grater than it is with or even with a mixer, but I don't think they had mixers in Europe in those days. Anyhow, processor, fine. So he says there's a distinction, and then he says something very interesting. He says, "V'lama nomar shebenot Yisrael osot shelo kadin." Why are you rabbis going around and criticizing these good Jewish women who've seen their mothers and grandmothers all use the hakmesser to chop up the onions. This is part of the living tradition. This is the mimetic tradition. This is what we do. You can justify it or you can attack it, but only you're making life difficult when you shouldn't. The Jewish kitchen is run not according to the rules of halakha. It's run according to a long tradition of kitchen people who've imbibed this tradition with their mother's meat and not milk, or milk, whatever the case may be. You shouldn't interfere with these things. Let's ask a different question. Anybody remember their grandparents? I remember mine preparing the wine for the Seder. What was the wine of choice amongst East European Jews, made by themselves with a whole lot of apparatus? They had pipes and they had funnels and they had these little paper things that they put inside the funnels. What wine were they making?
Raisin wine.
Thank you, Rosalind. Raisin wine, exactly. Who could have thought, who knew anything about a fine wine? We've become fine schmeckers in a very short period of time. But I remember my grandfather going down into the cellar. He had this whole apparatus up there. Is raisin wine yain meshubach, the sort of wine we now say, those of us who doubt whether you can use grape juice for your Seder? Why? It's not proper wine, doesn't have enough alcohol. Then we go into all sorts of measurements and we say, wow, it has to be like this, has to be like that, and give people quite a guilty conscience. Well, the Mishnah Brura says, ויפה לקידוש לצאת ידי כל החששות, וגם כדי לקיים מצווה מן המובחר. You really need real wine for the mitzvot of kiddush and of the 4 cups. And we have a problem with raisin wine. So in those days, it was very expensive. You had to get real wine, and that was quite tough. The Aruch HaShulchan says, well, he says, look, atzmukin shelanu shosim yain en behem kal lachuchit shel yain. There's not a drop of real alcoholic wine in raisin wine. Correct, Rosalind? It's not the real thing. V'rak al yidei shriatam b'mayim harbe zman yesh b'hamayim tam yain. You can get a taste that resembles wine, perhaps. And it's not it's more like Palwin number 4, very old-fashioned sort of sticky and sickly kiddush wine. ואיך אנו מברכים עליו בורא פרי הגפן ועושים עליו קידוש והבדלה מברכים בורא פרי הגפן? How can we use it for mitzvot? ואם באנו לשנות ולומר לברך שהכל, and if we tell people, well, no, actually you have to make the bracha of שהכל, לא יצייתו לנו. They're not going to listen to us. שכן מנהגנו מאבות אבותינו, the minhag that we've had from our ancestors, ואין פוצה פה ומצפצף, and nobody ever objected. And we, in my home, the Epstein home in Navardok, we make raisin wine in common with tens of thousands of households in somebody has come in, and I've lost the
Shirley,
Shirley.
stop your screen share.
Shirley, can you stop screen sharing, please?
Done. Oh no, it's still there.
Can we do that? Stopping.
Yeah, it's done. It's gone.
No, it hasn't. We're still there. Shirley, in order for me.
Oh, Shirley Zauer.
Ah, good. We're back. Please keep away from doing anything. Okay? So the Aruch HaShulchan says, "V'anachnu b'atzmeinu uvehekreach liyashev min hagan shel Yisrael." And we can find textual ways of justifying. That's what we should be doing. Not destroying minhagim because of a textual interpretation, but finding ways to justify them, which we can. Aruch HaShulchan gives us a way of justifying the fact that the raisin wine can in fact serve as wine because it has something like, reminds us of the taste of wine. He uses the principle of tam ki'ikar in halakha. Let me ask you, do any of you had biscuits or cakes with letters on that you've eaten, say for a kid's party on Shabbat? Will all the guilty of parties please raise their hands? Rebecca, yes, but isn't that mechika? You are erasing a letter. Did you think about that? Okay, well, here, okay, so the Mishnah Berurah says, yeah, that's a real problem. Look, it may not be midoraita, but it's not erasing like letters in a document, but midrabanan, we go from the core to the periphery. Any type of erasing could fall under the category of mechika at the rabbinical level. So psik ratio, it's also something that you cannot avoid. Once you eat the cake, once you break off a piece of cake, all right, you're not going to stuff a whole cake in your mouth at once, which will be one solution, okay? Rebecca, you've baked a fantastic cake, and now whoever wants to eat it, take the whole cake, stuff it into the something out of the Roald Dahl book, Matilda, okay? The chocolate cake has to be eaten, the whole thing. No, so we break off pieces, you're breaking the letters off. Psik ratio, you can't avoid it. It is mifika, va'asur, af bidrabanan. And therefore, we have to be careful, okay? And what you should do then, the Mishnah Berurah, of course, always also works hard. He says, look, you break the cake off without destroying the letters. The fact that you mash it up in your mouth and then you do mangle and destroy the letters is okay, all right? So again, a bit like what he did in relation to the fish. The Mishnah Berurah is sensitive and he tries very hard to find some, these textual his textual forays are often less convincing than we would really like them to be, and they point up the weakness here. The Aruch HaShulchan has no problem at all. He says, Ein ha'olam nisarim bazeh, we are not careful with this, because this is like icing on the cake. And lo shayach shem ktiva. Look, it's not writing. We're not writing a letter. We're just decorating something. He says, wake up and smell the hummus. You have to understand what your aim and your goal is. And if you create everything in a textual interpretation mode, and then it kind of makes life seem, you're not here communicating. Writing is communication. And this is decoration. It's meant to be eaten. It's not meant to be sent on the Instagram. And we were talking about something entirely different. So the Aruch HaShulchan says, that's interesting. And this is also the reason for being somewhat critical of the extent to which electricity has become asur on Shabbat. All sorts of electrical devices that are there that prevent you, say, getting into your room. That's not really wanting to use electricity for heat or light. You want to get into your room. So is there a shem malacha? Would we call this a malacha or a malechet machashevet? The same here. We're not writing in the classical sense of writing a letter, sending a serious communication. Du gam ken ma'achal. It's more like food. You're giving people a nice tasty thing. You're decorating with some letters. A sense of proportion as to the balance between the mimesis of the practice and the text. Umutar legamre u'me'ikar adin ein bazeh isur. And in his way of interpreting, there's no isur here at all. Finally, well, not finally, let's see how much time we have. We'll go until 9:30 if that is okay. If you're interested in this, and then I'd like to bring all this together and give you my take. But how about wearing jewelry on Shabbat? Do the women in attendance of this drasha wear their jewelry on Shabbat? Will the guilty parties raise their hands, please? And I'm sure there are many who've blocked out their picture because they would be saying so, okay? Everybody wears jewelry on Shabbat. I mean, the women, of course, perhaps some of the men too. But I assume you are aware that there is a problem that stems from the Talmud about what you can go out with on Shabbat, what you can wear. And some of the things that count as women's jewelry, you should not leave your house with. Why? Because you might take them off in a place where there's no eruv. You would be carrying them, and that would be an isur midda oraita. And in order to stop you doing that, well, you might pull out your earring and show it to a friend in the middle of a public street, okay, or outside of shul. and that would be carrying. Now, how many times have the women pulled out the earrings to show their friends on whichever road we are talking, Balaclava Road, okay, outside Shore in Melbourne? Do you pull off pieces of jewelry, or in Brent Street outside of there? Do you pull off
No.
pieces of jewelry to show your friends?
Not at all.
You do?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Warren
Not at all.
Okay, not at all, Marcel. You never pull off your jewelry. Your jewelry.
That was me.
Okay. All right. So it's interesting. But the Mishnah Brura, who goes by the text, says, Dilma shilfa umachvaya. She might take it off to show, therefore it is asur midrabanan. So your rabbi should be criticizing you. Don't come to shul wearing the jewelry. Now that wouldn't go down well. So the Aruch HaShulchan has another source, and he says that there is a concept of nashim chashuvot, that there is an exception for women who know the halacha and will not take the jewelry off in the street. And in any case, he says we have a long tradition of many years, and women wear their jewelry to shul, and ein poteach pe umetzavtzef. This is what we do. This is what we've seen done by very, 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 very religious people. It reminds me of something that Dayan Gershon Lopian once said. The Isur of Chodosh. We don't use the new flour, okay? So he was once asked by a member of his congregation in the Edgeware Adas, I think, why aren't we careful about Chodosh, the new wheat, that we're not going to use it until second day of Pesach are passed in our shul? Well, so Dayan Lopian said, you know what? The Bach, famously, Rabbi Yosef said that in Chutz La'aretz, Chadash and Yashan, that whole halakha doesn't apply. But even if, and also he says, look, Dayan Lopian, his grandfather was Reb Elia Lopian, okay, who eventually became the mashgiach of Kfar Hasidim, tremendously respected in Lithuanian Haredi circles. So Dayan Lopian said, my father wasn't makpid, careful about Chodosh. My grandfather, and he was very frum, my grandfather was not careful about Chodosh, and he was extremely frum, and I'm not frummer than they. So again, it's this kind of very interesting interplay. The Aruch HaShulchan will always say, we do it, we've done it, we shouldn't interfere with that in any, if it's not something that cannot be justified at all. The question is, do you choose to justify or do you choose to criticize? Okay, there are some rabbis who solve problems. There are some rabbis who raise problems about solutions. Question is, I guess, what your starting point is. I'm not going to go into women's hair covering, but very famously, the Aruch HaShulchan ruled that you can recite Shema in the presence of a woman with uncovered hair, because our women go around in Lithuania in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with uncovered hair, and you can say your Shema and anything else you want to say in their presence. And the last illustration I'm going to bring is actually something that we dealt with we deal with in our communities these days, Eruv on Shabbat. You may or may not know that one of the problems with the Eruv in a big city is that there are too many people in the city, and it becomes a reshut harabim, and then it's very difficult to make an Eruv. And that's why there are many, Haredim who hold out against the making of an Eruv in an urban setting. The Aruch HaShulchan, Orach Hayim Siman Shin Mem Hey Sif Yudchet says, okay, there may be a difficulty here with the Shishim Ribol, with the number of people going through the streets. Aval al kol panim mamo il ha'arichut. Why are we going on analyzing this halacha? Acharei sha'eruvin nitpashtu berov arei Yisrael harbe meot shanim. We've had eruvin in European cities for hundreds of years. They had them all over Europe. Varak al smach heter zeh. And we've always used the heter, that issue of a number of people is not a critical issue. bat kol yatsa halacha kishita zo. And the bat kol, it's like, who has heard? Bring us back to Hillel. There is a tradition. ואם באנו לעכב, לא לבד שלא יצייתו, and in any case, people are not going to listen. אלא נראה כשמשתגעים, we'd be thought as being crazy. שדבר זה נתפשט בכל ישראל, ובפוסקים דעידנא אין לנו רשות הרבים, רק בערים ספורות. Very few cities have this problematic רשות הרבים. ויען כי מצווה וחובה ללמד זכות על כלל ישראל. It's a mitzvah and an obligation to justify the Jewish people. ולכן שמתי את ליבי להמציא איזה היתר, and now I'm going to justify the way that we can. In other words, you can always justify with a text. The question is it worthwhile? And is what you're going to do by criticizing what people are doing going to cause more damage, or is it going to cause more good? Mr. Brewer is as usual. He admits that there is a problem. And then he says, you know what? V'chol bal nefesh yachmir latzmo, which is something that he uses often. A bal nefesh, somebody who cares about his soul, will take care and be strict and not use the Eruv. And hence you have a whole cluster of non-Eruv users wherever you go, okay? So, to bring all of this together, there may be a price to pay for what Chaim Soloveitchik says has been the move to textualism. Remember, for hundreds of years, I'm talking about Eastern Europe just from the 15th century. Say, okay, how many halakhic books were written on the laws of Shabbos? Okay, how many books? You could count them on the fingers of two hands. How many books on the laws of Shabbos you find if you go into an art scroll shop, go to Eichler's in Flatbush? How many books on laws of Shabbos do you think there are? Just a regular day going into the shop. You do a survey, I found 573. Small, large, English, Hebrew, never existed in the past. People learned how to do from other people who did. So now we are basically drowning in a world of textual interpretation. Now, there may be a price to pay for that. And the price to pay may be something that's happening to Orthodox Jewry today, and it may have a reflection on what we do this coming Seder night. When we sit down to the Seder, what are we going to be focusing on? How many grams is our matzah? How long we have to eat it? Do we have to make an effort? And do we have to basically stuff our faces? And are we then going to weigh up the lettuce we have for maror? And are we going to figure out what is a cheeks full of wine as opposed to a rov kos? And we spend our entire evening in measurements and in times, and it's a clockwork universe. Do we think about redemption, about God, about the fate of the Jewish people? Are we going to think about something to do with the time we are living in today, linking it perhaps with some of the words of the songs, or are we going to focus on Rav Avraham Chaim Naeh said it's 86 cc's. The Chazon Ish is 150. Okay, do we need more wine, less wine? Who's a Chazon Ishnik? Who follows Rav? And if you are a Chazon Ishnik, you say, why are you following Rav Naeh? And your whole evening becomes a kind of a mini shiur klali in the yeshiva. Is that what we want? Is that what we should be aiming for? Now, whilst Chaim Soloveitchik didn't make this point, the Haredi world too. What happened to God? What happened to the emotive, to the spiritual, to the feeling of a night of redemption? Chayav Adam laharot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. We have to feel it. We have to experience it. It's an experiential thing. So I would never say abolish the laws of Kazait for matzah on Pesach, abolish the laws of the Revit Yain for matzah on Pesach. What I might say is that perhaps we should focus on the focus and try and get it right, perhaps do a little better and bring God and ideas and the feeling in particular, what it means to be a Jew awaiting redemption, sitting that dramatic night in Egypt, waiting for God's presence to manifest itself. What would that have felt like? And can we incorporate that feeling into our lives and into the way we practice our Judaism? May be a lot better for us as the Orthodox community, perhaps for world Jewry. Isn't necessarily all Orthodox, but may be interested in the tradition if we can somehow find a better balance between textual and the mimetic. So I think that that's the point that I wanted to bring this shiur to for a close. And I want to wish everybody a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, but I certainly am happy to take a question or an observation. Now you can all unmute, but don't go and have private conversations, please. Whoever wants to make a point is invited to unmute and to speak fourth, or fifth, or sixth,
Or first.
or first. Anybody? Well, there's a resounding silence, so either nobody followed, or it's just too stunning, and we're all just in shock.
Appreciating.
Didn't we say that it's more important to learn from Sofrim than from Sfarim?
Robert, I didn't say what's more important. We saw that there are two sides as we began, and I did say, though, that the Yerushalmi and the Bavli do argue about that. That's a general thesis I'm not going to go into now, but you need both. You need both, and the question is, have we lost, perhaps, the mimesis and everything it stands for, going back into the past, reliving not only the texts of the past, but the experiences, how Jews felt in the past about being Jewish. That sort of thing that was passed. And remember, you yourself will know that if you have a father with a strong Jewish identity and a strong emotional link, that speaks to you. That may be more important in the educational process to understand as a child the emotion behind what the mitzvot that are being practiced in your home or the Torah than being simply a genius who has mastered all the texts. And that may be the problem that we are in fact facing. We all complain, many educators in the Orthodox will complain about the fact that Gemara seems to leave a lot of kids cold. But if you go back to a childhood where the Gemara was sung and where it became a matter of sharing a lot of agadah, stories and love, well, that makes it a whole different ball game. And that may be what's lacking to a certain extent in the way we practice our orthodoxy. I'm just giving you something to think about, but that's what I was saying. It's the balance between what we have as a living tradition embodied in people and the analytical skill, sometimes the brilliant pilpulim, that we imbibe in the yeshiva and from the yeshiva-oriented rabbi. Okay? Has that answered the question, Robert?
Yes, thank you. It was fascinating. Thank you.
My pleasure. Are there any more, or shall we all be released? We're going from bondage to freedom. I can close the meeting. So again, Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and
Thank you very much for a very revealing evening.
Very
thank
interesting.
you.